Good morning, church. Great to see everybody this morning. Great to see all of your smiling faces. Clint, thank you so much for the wonderful job that you do for us. Song service is always exceptional. It's great to be here worshiping our Lord this morning together. And you know, I've heard it said this week by more than one person that we are the most interrupted people in human history. And I suppose maybe we are. Everybody has the experience of saying to a wife, a husband, a co-worker, a child, please don't interrupt me, right? And we don't always just say it with our words. We can say it with a look. We can say it by turning our back or in some other way that we let them know that, hey, I'm doing something and I don't wish to be stopped. And yet life has its interruptions and there's no real way around them. They have to be coped with instead of denied. And when I look at the life of Jesus carefully in the New Testament, I'm impressed with the fact that he never went through a single day, it seems, without being interrupted a number of times, at least not after he launched his ministry. And he seemed to be unable to go anywhere, to be in a quiet enough place, to keep people from coming to him in droves. They're always wanting something from him, wanting to hear a lesson, wanting to talk with him, or in some way interrupting what otherwise might have been a rather routine schedule. For example, we look at the Gospel of Mark. And in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, the 35th verse, it says, "In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, 'Everyone is searching for you.' He tries to get up early in the morning before daytime and go out to a place where he can pray. And his disciples, followed by this drove of people, they're hounding him and they follow him. And the report is, everybody's looking for you. Where'd you go?" A little later in chapter 3 of Mark, chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, he's just appointed the 12 apostles. And Mark says this, he says, "Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat." He's chosen 12 men to help, and he goes home for a period of relaxation. And so many in the crowd come that they can't even eat a meal. In chapter 6 of Mark, chapter 6, verse 32, Mark says, "They went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves." This is Jesus and his disciples. "And now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things." The little Sea of Galilee is only about 8 miles wide and 14 miles long. And you can run around the edge of it virtually to beat a boat if it's going at an angle to a different spot. And Jesus tries to get away to another location, and it's exactly what the people do. They always head over here, and they head around. And they're there waiting for him when he gets there. He's interrupted again. And there are other instances, like in Mark, the 2nd chapter, he's in a house teaching, and some of the people, you know this story, some of the people try to get a paralytic into the house. And when they're not able to get through the door because of the throngs of people, they go up on the roof and they tear a hole in the roof. And just imagine trying to have a Bible study where there's people around, and all of a sudden the house begins to break up and somebody's lifted in a pallet down through the roof. Or in Luke chapter 12, we see it again. He's standing teaching a lesson. He's in the middle of teaching a lesson, and here comes a rich man up to him, and he says, "Lord, talk to my brother and get him to divide the inheritance with me." He is scarcely able to even finish a sermon at times because people would come to settle some personal differences or problems that they have. And that's when he gave his famous story, of course, to this man, the story of the rich fool who's going to tear down his barns and build bigger ones in order to teach this man that this man's life doesn't consist of what he possesses, and to break down that greed and covetousness that made him so anxious about whether he's going to be a part of his inheritance and get his inheritance. And it isn't just Jesus and Jesus' life, and it's not just our lives that we see this interruption taking place. It's all through the Bible. At a time that we think is quiet, at a time that is pastoral environment maybe, it's like a farming environment. All through that period, there are interruptions in people's lives. For instance, Jacob. Jacob worked for 7 years for Rachel, only to learn that he'd gotten Leah instead. Right? That's quite an interruption. 7 years of your life. So then he works another 7 years so that he can have the girl he really wanted. What about Joseph? He's sold into Egyptian slavery. It takes him years to build the kind of reputation to get a position of being a leader in that land. But what about Daniel? Daniel goes into captivity and has the same kind of experience, really. He's interrupted, but after a time he proves his dependability and gets a new task. Or there's Paul, great example of being interrupted. 2 years in prison at Caesarea. 2 years in prison at Rome. Yet while in prison, he turns out several books of the New Testament. He's learned to cope with interruption and to use that in a constructive way. And in this text, Acts chapter 3, Peter and John have started to the temple at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to pray. It was a Jewish custom, and even though that they're Christians, they still follow these Jewish customs, and they're going for the hour of prayer. And I suppose, to put it in our language, in today's parlance, instead of going out for coffee at 3 p.m., they're going to the temple for an hour of prayer, for a prayer break. People just did that. And it was part of their way of life. And Peter and John are going about that practice. And as they started into the temple, they were approached by a man who had been lame and who lay every day at the gate of the temple. And he got there by people carrying him there. They'd carry him in and they'd carry him out every day. Some of the translations indicated that he was carried to that spot right at that moment. But regardless, it really doesn't matter. He confronts them there and he catches them at their most vulnerable point. Because if people will ever help somebody in need, it's going to be church. So at the gate of the temple, he asks for an alms, and Peter stops. Even though he's had plans to go inside for an hour of prayer, he stops and he talks to the man. And when the man asks him for alms, Peter says, "I don't have any silver or gold, but what I have I'll give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, get up and walk." And the man got up and he walked. He felt strength in his ankles. He began to leap and singing and praising God through the temple. People were amazed and they recognized him. He's the same beggar that laid outside. You know, if you live in a town for any period of time, a city or a small town, there are going to be spots and places that you kind of become accustomed to seeing someone who's in need or in help. And they'll kind of pick out spots that are their spots. And there they are. There they are again today. They'll be there tomorrow maybe. And that's exactly what's happened here. They recognized this man and knew something very strange had happened. And so they rush out to the portico of the temple and they find Peter and John, and Peter begins to say to them, "Don't look at us so strangely, as if by some power of ours we've made this man whole. It's through the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth that he stands before you whole." Then Peter began his second sermon. The resurrection and ascension of Christ has occurred. Peter had preached on Pentecost, of course, and now for a second time he preaches a messianic sermon. And he shows how Christ had come to fulfill the prophets. And the 4th chapter of Acts opens with the arrest of Peter and John, because it's nearly evening by now. It's gone from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and the time is passing. And they're put in jail overnight so that they can be tried the following day. And it's on that following day that they had the opportunity to preach again to the council of the Jews. And Gamaliel, of course, finally gives his advice about not persecuting them. If they were men, they'd come to nothing. If they were of God, then there is no way to stop it. And all of that is the setting. But it points to a number of truths that I'm sure explain why this passage is here. One of them is the growth of the early church, I think. Luke wanted us to know the way the church got off to such a striking beginning. The number of the disciples, after all, in Acts chapter 4, verse 4, it says, at the end of this sermon, includes 5,000 men. It's also a record of the preaching of the apostles. What we can learn from their sermons, what they were like, the points they emphasized and insisted upon. But among the many things this passage gets across, I want to focus on one, and that is how Peter dealt with something that's so common in your busy life and mine. In a time when we have to schedule our hours and our energies because they run out before we're through, it pays to know something about how to deal with interruption, especially if you can turn that into opportunity. Now, everybody here knows what I'm talking about. You may not have thought the Bible had a great deal to say about it on this subject, but, a young mother who's experienced looking through the grocery advertisements, trying to make that food budget stretch through the week. And right in the midst of her concentration, her child turns up and wants to know how to tie a shoelace. She knows something about what interruption is. The young mother who's gone all day, worked hard, just worn out, lies down, falls right to sleep. A little tap comes on his shoulder. Mommy, I can't sleep. Child crawls into bed. He's asleep in seconds. She's awake. Can't go back to sleep. She knows what interruption is. Or, you're trying to get the house ready for guests coming for dinner, right? The phone rings, dinner's on the stove, laundry's on the couch, bills are spread across the table. The salesman rings the doorbell and wakes up the baby. You know what interruption is. Or if you've got a business deal or a sale that's just about ready to break, and you've got to cut and run to some meeting that's rather insignificant, but it has to go on as scheduled. You know what interruption is. A high school senior who has an athletic scholarship but suddenly gets injured and has that scholarship rescinded knows what interruption is. Or just countless cases and examples. A person falls into a routine of life, and everything seems to be going rather well, and then an accident, an illness, or our whole lifestyle has to be changed. Or you have a deep commitment in life for the love that's been given to you by God Himself. And then death comes. Everybody knows what interruption is. More or less seriously, we know them, and we live with them. Now, the Bible has something to say, and a great deal of it is right here in this passage, about how to deal with the interruption that comes in life. There are several options that we can pick. One of them, I suppose, is just resisting any interruption that comes. A lot of people, without any appreciation of the fact that life is going on and going to have these interruptions, they aren't ready when they come, and perhaps no one of us is really ready when they come. But just as it takes storms for nature to carry on her course, there are going to be storms in life. There are going to be problems that are going to break us. And if we aren't prepared in some way other than just stern resistance, people who've lived, for example, in hurricane territory, know that in an area like Florida, right, for example, you've got those palm trees, beautiful palm trees, pecan trees, and when those 100+ mile-an-hour winds come in, they gain the ability to bend with the breeze. And they can virtually bend over to the ground, but they have the resilience that they straighten right back up when it's gone. The human spirit has to develop some of that quality. Think about the very first automobile tire. You know that those earliest tires were solid rubber. They weren't hollow. They were just big, thick pieces of rubber. That's the only way they knew how to make them. I guess it's better than riding on steel or wood. It's a little bit of an improvement. But when those solid rubber tires would come into contact with a pothole that wasn't supposed to be there in the road, eventually they would break up. And sometimes it wasn't eventually, it was very quickly. And they would just shred into pieces. There's no such thing then about, such thing as a lasting tire until somebody got the idea of building one that would be soft and flexible and resilient. And the human spirit has to come to that. That's one way of trying to meet an interruption. Just stern resistance doesn't do it. But it doesn't work as well, for sure, as a resilient spirit. A lot of other people meet interruptions and disappointments in life with just a kind of philosophical determination, much like the ancient Stoics. We just make up our minds that we won't be moved by anything. We'll never show any feeling. We'll just go through life and hit everything head on and never let anyone know our cares. We may make it through life that way, but very little positive good is going to be done in the process. Do you know what they used to do to help people who had surgery on the battlefield before anesthetics? They simply gave them a stick or rolled up a piece of cloth for them to bite down on to keep them from grinding their teeth into powder under the pain. There are people who face life that way. But that, again, isn't the best way. There's a Christian point of view. There's a Christian way to face hindrances and interruptions and disappointments, heartbreak, or whatever, that comes through trying to see some creative opportunity and even an evil thing that happens to us. Coming to realize that sometimes the only way God can open the door for us is to shut another one. The only way He can give us an opportunity to serve in a creative way is to close off the way we're trying to spend our lives, that we may not explain and be able to explain every disappointment with that, but it helps in meeting them. I read somewhere the difference between a rooster and an eagle when a storm comes is that a rooster will wrap his wings around himself and he'll sit there come what may. Seems like a pretty good idea. But an eagle will spread his wings and he will fly into the force of that storm, and that storm will lift him up to greater heights. If you think about it, the only way an airplane can take off from the ground is if it's going against the wind. And again, the human spirit responds in one of those two ways. It isn't an easy thing, but there are some clues in this passage, and if we look carefully at those clues, perhaps they'll help us as we face interruption. So let's go back to the text here then and look for those clues to find some direction, because the Scriptures are full of this kind of thing. There's a lot of gold in here that's never mine. One of the things we see in this passage is that Peter and John had a regular schedule of activities. It pays to evaluate occasionally what one is doing with his or her life, how it's being spent. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Peter and John are in the temple. 9 out of 10 days, they're going to be there. There may be something that interrupts the schedule. But if you're able to do what you have scheduled to do this week, how much will you be able to accomplish? Are you really setting yourself out to do anything? Or are you just letting life come as it will? Evaluating one's schedule, our plans and our purposes, the way that we spend life and our time and energies can be a helpful way forward. And the second clue to come from Peter and John, the way they handled their life, is that they were people conscious. They wanted to go to prayer, but they were even more conscious at the moment of the need of that paralyzed man. There are demands in every direction from these men. Peter and John must have been very pressured individuals. If you read those early chapters of Acts and realize that with Jesus gone and back to heaven, and the apostles having to carry on, thousands of converts coming into the new body, Peter and John must have been tremendously busy. There would have been all sorts of people who wanted to talk with them. Others who wanted to hear them preach, to learn something about the Messiah. But in the midst of all that pressure, Peter still has time to go for a prayer and has time to stop for a person's need. He's aware of people. All around you this week, I guarantee you, all around you, there's going to be paralyzed people. And they may not all be physically paralyzed, but they're going to be paralyzed nonetheless. They're going to be paralyzed by anger. They're going to be paralyzed by fear. They're going to be paralyzed by anxiety. And being conscious of people is one of the things we develop from a passage like this. A third clue and way to handle life is when Peter says to the man who's paralyzed, "Look at us," he says. That's interesting. Look at us. That doesn't just come in the moment of crisis when you need something to do to help another person. Peter had for a long time been living that kind of life that would make him an exemplary example. And he could say to a man, now that the moment of crisis has come, look at us. We found something that you need. And if you go through life not expecting to be of any help to others, then we don't develop that kind of strength. But Peter had it, and now he could share it. And the early church did much in this way. They did much of their preaching, not through pamphlets, not through conventions, not through books, but they did it in the way that they lived, letting people look at them. They could go singing before lions, literally, because they'd been with Jesus. They could face the sword with a song, and they did. And that's what led people. Their sacrifice in winning others was one of the most powerful things they did. So Peter says, look at us. A fourth clue to his use of life is when he says, I don't have any silver or gold, but what I have I'll give you. He is willing to give. Freely you've received, freely give, so Jesus taught. Now, all of these are principles that get wrapped up in our own service of God. And after all, the people conscious, the exemplary life, the willingness to give is what the church is all about. Where a church begins to sit down and struggle with its own needs and future. When it sits down and it sets out its priorities. Where people are first, programs are second, the buildings and the like are third, we begin to develop this kind of spirit. The most valuable things in life have to be given away. If they aren't given away, they're lost. And you can start with money. If you don't give it away, if you aren't generous with it, it becomes mammon and it controls you. Or you can think about love. Great example of love. If love isn't shared, it becomes lust. It's privately held, dwelled on in unhealthy ways. Or if it's the love of Christ even, it becomes self-righteousness if it isn't shared with somebody. Whatever a person has, if he doesn't give it, he's going to lose it. And that's one of the principles about facing life that Peter and John had learned. Perhaps the final thing that they had learned in their approach to life and the final clue that comes from this passage is that something very unexpected had happened out of an interruption. Just when it looks like every plan you had has been overturned, a good thing occurs. And that's what occurs here. A man goes leaping and praising God through the temple. You know, if we could just know that when we're interrupted, we'll be praised. Most of us would be willing to be interrupted. But the praise doesn't come to Peter. It came to Peter's God. But something wonderful happened when he was willing to have his schedule interrupted for a moment. The whole story really is reminiscent of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite went on the other side of the road, right? And we don't know all the reasons. We've surmised many of them, but one of them might have been that there's a schedule to meet for the priest and the Levite. There's a place to go. And this fellow would interfere with that. He would hold them up. He would break their routine, keep them from meeting their appointments. But it was the Samaritan who had time, and he took care. And that is the man about whom Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." The interruptions of life is what they are. They're unexpected opportunities. And they ought to be turned into creative opportunities to serve God. After all, the only way God has at getting through to us, many of us, is to interrupt us. Every day, we interrupt His purposes for our lives. All day long, we do that by our own selfishness. And the only way He can get through to us is to interrupt us. By interrupting, by turning us in another direction. When the child wants to know about the shoestring, the interruption may be used in a profitable way. Or when you need someone to help you get to sleep as a child, and the parent's there, and here's the opportunity, it might be an experience that's helpful to the formation of a stable character. It would be hard to imagine an interruption that cannot be put to a profitable use if we can come to the faith that Peter had. And what we have, right? What we've received. We're willing to share it with others, even though it does interrupt the routine that we'd planned for the moment. That is a giving spirit that ought to be flowing out of each one of us. Maybe you need to turn to the Lord this morning and find in Him the kind of strength that will enable you to help others who are in need. His forgiveness and the waters of baptism are open to all. Won't you come this morning while we stand and sing?